The dinner bag was still warm in her hands when Aaliyah Monroe pushed open the front door of the mansion and stepped into silence that felt wrong. 6 years of marriage had taught her the sound of this house. The hum of the security system, the soft click of the study door, the particular quiet that meant her husband was home and thinking. But tonight the quiet had a different texture. It pressed against her skin like a held breath. She set the bag down on the marble console table, careful not to let the containers rattle. Inside was his favorite dish, the one she'd learned to make in their first year together, back when she still burned rice and he still laughed instead of frowning. Tonight was their anniversary. She had wanted to surprise him. A voice drifted from the living room. Low. Familiar. Yoonghwan Yeo's voice. The one he used only when he thought no one else could hear. She smiled and started toward the sound, anniversary card in hand, until 3 words stopped her cold. Once the divorce is finalized. Aaliyah's feet moved before her mind caught up. She slipped behind the tall couch that faced away from the hallway, pressing her back to the cool leather, heart hammering against her ribs. You'll become my wife. The card slipped from her fingers and landed silently on the rug. She should have made a sound. She should have stood up right then and demanded to know what she was hearing. Instead, she stayed frozen, knees pulled toward her chest, listening to the man she loved promise his future to someone else on speakerphone, in their own home, on the night she'd planned to tell him she was finally ready to try for a baby. A woman's laugh floated through the phone's tinny speaker. Warm. Confident. Familiar in a way that made Aaliyah's stomach twist even before she understood why. You always know what to say, the woman said. Mother says the documents will be ready by Friday. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that laugh. She had grown up falling asleep to that laugh through a shared bedroom wall. It was her sister's voice. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe so you never miss what happens next, because this story only gets more shocking from here. Aaliyah sat behind that couch for what felt like an hour, though the clock on the wall said only 6 minutes had passed. 6 minutes to unravel 6 years. 6 minutes for the floor of her life to open beneath her and swallow everything she thought she understood. She thought of the day she'd met Yoonghwan at a charity auction she'd attended as a favor to a college friend. She hadn't known who he was. She'd known only that he stood at the edge of the room like a man used to being watched and unused to being approached, and that when she'd walked up to ask if the seat beside him was taken, something in his rigid shoulders had eased. He told her later that no one had ever asked him a simple question without an angle behind it. She had no angle. She was a girl from a modest family who'd worked 2 jobs through business school, who liked jazz records and burnt coffee and long walks with no destination. She didn't know, that first night, that he ran an empire built on things she would spend years trying not to ask about. She only knew that he listened to her like her words mattered, and that no one had ever done that before. It took months for her to learn the truth of what his family business really was. By then it was too late to walk away cleanly, because she had already fallen in love with the man underneath the danger. He was careful with her in a way he was careful with nothing else in his life. He built walls around her like a fortress, not to trap her, but to keep the world's ugliness from ever touching her. She married him knowing exactly what she was choosing. She gave up the comfortable anonymity of an ordinary life for the complicated privilege of loving a dangerous man well. She learned to smile at galas full of people who feared her husband. She learned when to ask questions, and when silence was its own kind of loyalty. She built a life inside his world, and made it beautiful, the way only someone who has known scarcity can make luxury feel like a home instead of a cage. She thought that was enough. She thought loyalty, sacrifice, and love were enough. Now, crouched behind a couch in her own living room, she understood how little any of it had mattered. The call ended. She heard Yoonghwan's footsteps cross the room, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who believed himself entirely alone. A drawer opened. Papers shuffled. Then his footsteps retreated toward the study, and the door clicked shut behind him. Aaliyah rose slowly from behind the couch, her legs unsteady, and looked down at the fallen anniversary card. She did not pick it up. For the first time in her marriage, she let herself ask a question she had spent years avoiding. How long had this been happening? The answer, when it finally came weeks later, would break something in her that no apology could fully repair. But that night, she only knew one truth. The voice on the phone belonged to her younger sister, Vanessa Monroe, and whatever was happening between Vanessa and her husband had been building long enough to produce documents. Long enough to speak of divorce, like an appointment already on the calendar. Long enough that Aaliyah realized, with a cold and sinking certainty, that she might be the last person in this house to know. To understand how deep the betrayal ran, it helps to go back further, to a house much smaller than this one, where 3 girls grew up under one roof, and only 2 of them ever truly belonged. Aaliyah's mother had died when she was 9. Her father remarried 2 years later, bringing home a woman named Patricia and her daughter Vanessa, who was Aaliyah's age almost to the month. From the outside, it looked like a tidy blending of families. From the inside, Aaliyah understood early that she was the addition, not the center. Patricia was never cruel in ways anyone could point to and call abuse. She was careful, precise, the kind of unkindness that left no visible mark. She complimented Vanessa's grades in front of Aaliyah's report cards. She bought Vanessa new shoes for school photos and let Aaliyah wear hand-me-downs a size too small, always with some reasonable explanation attached. She said things like, "Your sister works so hard for what she has," in a tone that suggested Aaliyah's harder-won achievements were somehow less earned. Vanessa, for her part, grew up watching her mother's careful campaign and absorbing its lesson without ever needing it spelled out. Everything Aaliyah had was something Vanessa deserved more. It should have created distance between the sisters. Instead, for years, it created something stranger. Aaliyah, starved for the family closeness Patricia withheld, poured her affection into Vanessa freely, believing that if she loved her sister enough, the coldness in the house might finally thaw. Vanessa let herself be loved. She never once stopped keeping score. By the time Aaliyah married Younghwan, Patricia's whispered comparisons had sharpened into something closer to doctrine. "Everything your sister has should have been yours," she told Vanessa more than once, in the kitchen over wine, when she believed no one else was listening. "You were always the one who deserved more." Vanessa never argued. What began as envy calcified, over years, into a plan. It started small. A comment here, exaggerated to Younghwan during a family dinner about how tired Aaliyah seemed of the marriage. A photograph, cropped just enough to suggest closeness with a man who meant nothing to Aaliyah at all. A forged bank statement, slipped to one of Younghwan's most paranoid lieutenants, suggesting funds were disappearing into an account no one could trace. None of it was true. All of it was designed to be believed. Younghwan did not fall for lies easily. He had built an empire by trusting almost no one. But grief and paranoia make careful men vulnerable in ways nothing else can, and Patricia and Vanessa had spent years studying exactly where his fault lines ran. They knew he feared betrayal above all things, because betrayal was the currency of his world. They knew that if you tell a suspicious man a story that confirms what he already fears, he will believe it faster than any truth. So they built their case slowly, patiently, brick by brick, for nearly 2 years before that speakerphone conversation Aaliyah overheard behind the couch. By the time she discovered it, the foundation was already poured. The betrayal she thought she'd just stumbled onto was, in truth, nearly finished. If you're finding this story gripping so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it lets us know you want more stories like this one. In the days after the phone call, Aaliyah said nothing. She told herself she was gathering proof, though in truth she was still hoping, somewhere beneath the fear, that she had misheard, misunderstood, imagined the whole thing out of some private insecurity she hadn't known she carried. She watched Younghwan across the dinner table and searched his face for guilt, and found only the same tired distance that had crept into their marriage over the past year, a distance she had blamed on business pressures, never once suspecting its true source. She began noticing things she had trained herself not to notice. The way his phone stayed face down on every surface now. The late nights that used to come with an explanation, and now came with none. The way Vanessa's name appeared in his call log more than any business associates, disguised under a saved contact name that meant nothing to anyone but him. 2 weeks after the anniversary that never happened, Young-hwan came home holding a folder. He did not sit beside her. He stood across the room, the coffee table between them like a boundary he'd already decided to enforce, and told her, in a voice so calm it frightened her more than shouting would have, that he knew everything. He knew about the money she'd allegedly siphoned into an account under a name Aaliyah had never heard before. He knew about a man he claimed she'd been seen with, a man Aaliyah had never met in her life. He knew, he said, about medical records suggesting she had known for years she couldn't have children and had hidden that truth from him because she feared he would leave her for someone who could give him an heir. Aaliyah stood very still as each accusation landed, waiting for the moment he would laugh, or apologize, or admit this was some cruel test. That moment never came. "None of that is true," she said, when she finally found her voice. "Young-hwan, look at me. None of it is true. I have documents," he said. "Documents can be made to say anything if the person forging them is patient enough," she said. "Who gave you these?" He did not answer. He didn't need to. She already knew, with a certainty that made her knees go weak, exactly whose handwriting had shaped this story, because she had heard the beginning of it herself, through a speakerphone weeks before. "I heard you," she said quietly, "on the phone, with Vanessa. I heard you promise her marriage before you'd even finished divorcing me." For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to a man realizing the ground beneath him was less solid than he'd believed. But pride is a stubborn architecture, and Young-hwan had spent his entire adult life building himself around the belief that admitting a mistake was the same as admitting weakness, and weakness, in his world, got people killed. "You're deflecting," he said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I'm telling you the truth," Aaliyah said. "The same truth I've told you every day, for 6 years. The question is whether you're capable of hearing it anymore, or whether you've already decided who I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, and in that single averted glance, Aaliyah understood that the decision had already been made, probably weeks ago, probably before he'd ever confronted her with a folder at all. This conversation wasn't an investigation. It was a formality. He had come home not to ask her the truth, but to inform her of the verdict. "The divorce will be finalized within the month," he said. Aaliyah did not scream. She did not beg. Some small, wounded part of her had almost expected this moment for years, the way you expect thunder after seeing lightning, even when you hope, foolishly, that this time the storm might pass you by. "You're choosing lies over 6 years of truth," she said. "One day, Young-hwan, you're going to understand exactly what you threw away. I only hope it doesn't cost you everything to learn it." He said nothing. Men rarely do, in the moment before their pride costs them everything that mattered. She packed one suitcase that night. She left behind the jewelry, the cars, the wardrobe built over years of a life she no longer recognized as her own. She left behind the wedding photographs and the anniversary card still sitting, unread, on the living room floor where it had fallen weeks before. She took only what she had brought into the marriage, and a little of what she'd earned since, because Aaliyah Monroe had never once in her life wanted anything she hadn't rightfully deserved. At the door, she paused and looked back at the house that had been her home for 6 years. "I hope she makes you happy," she said, not because she meant it, but because some final scrap of dignity demanded she leave with grace instead of venom. "I hope it was worth losing me." The house did not answer. Houses never do. 3 months later, wedding photographs of Young-hwan Yeo and Vanessa Monroe appeared across every gossip outlet that covered Korea's business elite. Vanessa wore white silk and an expression of triumph she didn't bother to disguise. Patricia stood in the front row, glowing with a satisfaction that had taken over a decade to earn. Aaliyah saw the photographs on the small television in the one-bedroom apartment she now called home, a space so different from the mansion that some mornings she woke disoriented, reaching for a bedside table that no longer existed in the shape she remembered. She did not cry. She had cried already, in the weeks after the divorce, more than she thought a person could survive crying. She had cried until the tears stopped meaning anything, until grief became simply a fact of her days. The way weather is a fact you dress around rather than an event you react to. That night, watching her ex-husband and her sister smile for cameras and a marriage built on lies, Aaliyah did something she had never done before. She gathered every photograph she still owned of her old life, the wedding pictures, the vacation snapshots, the framed portrait that had once sat on his desk, and she burned them in the small metal wastebasket on her apartment's narrow balcony, one photo at a time, watching each memory curl into ash and drift over the railing into the city night. She did not burn them out of hatred. She burned them because she understood, with sudden and total clarity, that she could not build a new life while still carrying the weight of the old one, however carefully preserved. Some women break after betrayal like this, and there is no shame in that. Grief takes what it takes. But Aaliyah Monroe made a decision that night that would define the next 4 years of her life. She decided that betrayal would not get the final word in her story. She would write what came after herself. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested, and that means a lot to us. Drop a comment telling us who you think deserves justice first, because trust me, the story is only heating up. Rebuilding did not happen quickly, and it did not happen the way it does in the stories people tell themselves before they've actually lived through loss. There was no single triumphant montage. There was, instead, a long series of unglamorous mornings. Aaliyah took a job at a small security consulting firm, answering phones and filing reports, work far beneath what her business degree had once promised her, but work that paid rent and asked nothing of her except punctuality and competence. She studied at night, first out of restlessness, then out of something closer to purpose. She learned the fundamentals of corporate security, then cybersecurity, then the intricate systems that protect governments and executives from the kinds of threats her ex-husband's world had once shielded her from without her ever understanding the mechanics. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was good at it. The same instincts that had let her navigate the delicate politics of a Mafia household for 6 years, reading rooms, sensing danger before it announced itself, understanding which silences mattered and which were simply silence, translated with startling precision into the world of corporate risk assessment. Her first attempt at starting her own firm failed within 8 months. She had underestimated how much capital a startup required and overestimated how quickly clients would trust a woman with no established reputation in a field still dominated by men who'd spent decades building their names. She closed the company quietly, paid what she could, and took a salaried position at a larger firm to save what she'd need to try again. The second attempt lasted longer, nearly 2 years, before a larger competitor undercut her on a contract that would have secured the company's future. She watched the deal slip away and sat alone in her small office afterward, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and allowed herself exactly 1 hour to grieve the loss before she began drafting a new business plan. It was during her third attempt, for years after the divorce, that everything changed. A government agency, quietly seeking a security firm to handle a sensitive diplomatic contract, had grown frustrated with larger, slower-moving competitors who treated the work as just another line item. Aaliyah's firm was small enough to be agile and, by then, experienced enough to be trusted. She won the contract not through connections, since she had cultivated none of the old world's connections since her divorce, but through the simple, unglamorous strength of proving, meeting after meeting, that she understood the work better than anyone else in the room. The contract changed everything. Word spread through the industry the way it does when someone delivers exceptional work quietly rather than loudly announcing their ambitions. Within 2 years, her firm was protecting embassies on 3 continents. Within 3, celebrities and heads of state were requesting her company by name. She built a reputation for discretion, precision, and an almost uncanny ability to anticipate threats before they materialized, a skill, though she rarely said so aloud, she owed in part to years spent married to a man who had taught her, without meaning to, exactly how dangerous men think. By the time Aaliyah turned 34, she had built something Yoonghwan Yeo's own empire had never quite managed to become, an operation respected not through fear, but through genuine trust. She did not do it for revenge. She would tell interviewers, when they asked, that revenge was too small a motivation to sustain the kind of work she'd built her life around. She did it, she said, because she had once been a woman who believed her worth was tied to a man's approval, and rebuilding herself from nothing had taught her that her worth had never depended on anyone's approval at all. She never remarried. She dated occasionally, cautiously, but never let anyone close enough to reshape her the way marriage once had. Some wounds, she'd learned, don't need to be healed by replacing what caused them. They need to be healed by becoming someone the wound can no longer touch. While Aaliyah built her second life from nothing, Yoonghwan's world was quietly beginning to unravel, though he would not understand how thoroughly until it was far too late to stop it. The first cracks appeared within a year of his marriage to Vanessa. Small at first, easy to dismiss. A shipment delayed at a border it had never been delayed at before. A trusted lieutenant who grew evasive during routine check-ins. A political ally who stopped returning calls after decades of reliable partnership. Yoonghwan told himself these were the ordinary frictions of a business built on unstable foundations by definition. He did not yet understand that the person systematically destabilizing those foundations was sleeping beside him every night. Vanessa had married him believing marriage to a powerful man meant permanent access to his power. What she discovered, within months, was that Yoonghwan's world operated on hierarchies of trust built over decades. Hierarchies a new wife, however beautiful, however cunning, could not simply inherit by signing a marriage certificate. His lieutenants respected her position without ever fully respecting her. His financial networks remained, frustratingly, largely outside her reach. So Vanessa began building her own access, the same patient way she and her mother had once built the case against Aaliyah. Quietly, methodically, one small theft disguised as an accounting error at a time. She skimmed from accounts Yoonghwan trusted her to manage. She blamed discrepancies on employees who had no way to defend themselves against a boss's wife's accusations. Several were quietly dismissed. 1. A loyal accountant who had served Yoonghwan for over a decade was let go under suspicion he never deserved, protesting his innocence to the end while Vanessa stood beside her husband, expression carefully arranged into concern. Patricia, for her part, grew bolder as her daughter's position solidified. She began attending business functions she had no standing to attend, offering opinions on matters she understood only superficially, positioning herself as a kind of unofficial matriarch to an empire that had never once asked for her guidance. Yoonghwan tolerated it, partly out of the fatigue of a man who had already spent his emotional reserves defending his choices, and partly because he genuinely, tragically, still believed that Patricia and Vanessa were the family who had told him the truth when his first wife had not. He did not yet know how wrong that belief was. He would not know for 2 more years. The empire's true collapse began not with betrayal, though betrayal was its foundation, but with money, the way most empires eventually do. An investigation into unusual account activity, launched by a nervous board member who had grown suspicious of financial irregularities no one could quite trace, uncovered a series of transfers routed through accounts Vanessa had quietly established under names close enough to legitimate business entities that they'd escaped notice for years. By the time the pattern became undeniable, millions had vanished, moved offshore, restructured, laundered through shell companies scattered across 3 countries. Vanessa did not wait to be confronted. She left in the middle of the night, taking with her what remained of the liquid assets she could access, boarding a private flight arranged, investigators would later determine, by a wealthy foreign businessman she had been quietly cultivating a relationship with for over a year, a man with resources that dwarfed even what Yoonghwan had once possessed. She left behind a note that offered no apology, only the cold logistical detail of which accounts she had emptied, as though informing him of the theft was itself a courtesy. She also left behind their daughter, not yet 3 years old, asleep in her nursery, entrusted to a housekeeper's care with instructions that amounted to little more than an afterthought. Yoonghwan discovered the betrayal the following morning, standing in a bedroom stripped of half its contents, holding a note written in handwriting he had once mistaken for devotion. He lost, in the span of that single week, nearly everything that had once defined him. His empire, already weakened by years of Vanessa's quiet theft, could not absorb a loss of this magnitude. Lieutenants who had watched the marriage's dysfunction from a careful distance finally made their own moves, some defecting to rivals, some simply vanishing with whatever resources they could claim on their way out. Political allies, sensing weakness, withdrew their protection. Within months, the empire that had once made Jung Hwan-yeo one of the most feared men in Korea had crumbled into a shadow of itself, leaving him with debts, a fractured organization, and a toddler who cried for a mother who would never come back for her. He raised his daughter alone in those first difficult months, learning, at nearly 40, the exhausting mechanics of parenthood that power had always let him delegate to others. It was, in its own bitter way, the beginning of the only honest reckoning he would have with himself in years. We're just getting to the heart of the story, and I promise the biggest twist is still ahead. If you want to catch it the moment it happens, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the kind of ending you won't want to miss. The truth might have stayed buried forever if not for a man named Ishan Bot, an investigator Jung Hwan had once employed years earlier and quietly kept on retainer for minor matters long after the divorce, more out of habit than necessity. In the wreckage of the empire's collapse, searching for any lead on where Vanessa had funneled the stolen funds, Ishan began reopening old case files, hoping some earlier pattern of financial irregularity might reveal the trail he needed. What he found instead, buried in files no one had examined closely in years, was something far more damning. The medical records that had supposedly proven Aaliyah's infertility had never come from any hospital Aaliyah had visited. They had been fabricated, expertly but not perfectly, by a forger with connections to Patricia's family that Ishan traced back through 3 intermediaries. The bank statements suggesting Aaliyah had siphoned funds into a hidden account traced, when finally examined properly, to an account opened not by Aaliyah, but by Vanessa herself, using a signature forged just convincingly enough to pass a distracted verification years earlier. The photographs suggesting an affair, when Ishan finally located the original, uncropped images, showed Aaliyah standing beside a cousin of a former colleague at a business dinner, a completely innocent encounter twisted through selective cropping into something it had never been. Witnesses Ishan tracked down, former household staff who had left Jung Hwan's employ years earlier and had no remaining reason to protect anyone's secrets, confirmed what the documents already suggested. They had overheard Patricia and Vanessa discussing the fabricated evidence for months before it ever reached Jung Hwan. One had even overheard Patricia coaching Vanessa on precisely which details would most effectively exploit Jung Hwan's known fears. Ishan compiled everything into a single file and brought it to Jung Hwan on a quiet afternoon nearly 5 years after the divorce, sitting across from a man who had lost his empire, his second marriage, and very nearly his sense of who he was. Jung Hwan read the file in silence. He read it twice. When he finally looked up, his daughter's laughter drifted in from another room, the only sound in a house that had grown far too quiet in the years since his fortune had disappeared. "She never betrayed me," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ishan. "No," Ishan said. "She never did." Jung Hwan sat with that truth for a long time after Ishan left. He thought of the folder he'd carried into their living room years earlier, and the way Aaliyah had stood so still while he listed accusations that had never been true. He thought of the calm certainty in her voice when she'd told him he was choosing lies over 6 years of truth. He thought of every warning sign he had ignored because believing them would have meant admitting that the family who claimed to love him honestly had, in fact, been systematically destroying the one person who actually had. He had built his entire life around the ability to detect betrayal. He had failed, catastrophically, to recognize it standing in his own living room, wearing his own stepmother-in-law's careful smile. The weight of that failure did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, over the following weeks, the way grief for a mistake tends to arrive, in waves that catch you unprepared even when you think you've already absorbed the worst of it. He began, quietly, to search for Aaliyah. It was not difficult, in the end, though it took him longer than it should have, mostly because Jung Hwan kept expecting to find a woman diminished by what he had done to her, and diminished women are harder to locate than the alternative, because they tend to keep themselves small and hidden. What he found instead, after several weeks of careful inquiry, was a name attached to international headlines he had somehow, in the isolation of his own collapse, entirely missed. Aaliyah Monroe was not hiding. She was, by every measure that mattered, thriving. Her security firm had grown into one of the most respected in its field, trusted by embassies, protecting the kind of clients who could afford to hire anyone and chose, repeatedly, to hire her. Business publications had profiled her rise from nothing, though none of them, he noticed with a strange twist of shame, had ever mentioned the marriage that had once defined her entire identity. She had built a name for herself that owed nothing to his. He learned, too, of the foundation she had quietly begun funding, one that supported women rebuilding their lives after devastating personal loss, offering the kind of practical support Aaliyah herself had never had access to in the raw months after her own divorce. He stared at photographs of her at industry events, elegant in a way that had nothing performative about it, confident in a way that made the confidence he remembered from their marriage look, in retrospect, like careful survival rather than genuine ease. She looked, in every image he found, like a woman who had built herself into someone entirely new, someone stronger than the wife he had once discarded over lies he'd been too proud to question. He did not reach out immediately. Some remaining scrap of self-awareness told him that whatever right he'd once had to her attention, he had forfeited it the night he chose a folder of forged documents over 6 years of demonstrated love. The opportunity came, unplanned, several months later, at an international charity gala hosted by an organization Aaliyah's foundation had partnered with, an event Jung-hwan attended only because a former business associate, now working in philanthropy, had insisted his presence might help rebuild some of the credibility his name had lost. He saw her from across the room before she saw him, and for a long moment, he simply watched, unable to move. She stood near the center of the room, listening to another guest with a kind of unhurried attention he remembered from the very first night they'd met, years before either of them understood what their lives would eventually cost each other. She wore deep emerald, understated, the kind of elegance that didn't need announcement. She laughed at something the guest said, and the sound reached him across the room, achingly familiar and entirely changed, the laugh of a woman who had built a life that no longer required his approval to feel complete. When she finally turned and saw him, something crossed her face, too brief to name, gone before he could interpret it. Not the shock he'd braced for. Not even, as far as he could tell, anger. Something closer to recognition of a stranger who happened to resemble someone she used to know. She excused herself from her conversation and crossed the room toward him, unhurried, and stopped a careful distance away, close enough for conversation, far enough that the space between them felt deliberate. Jung-hwan, she said. Just his name. No warmth, no coldness. A simple fact stated aloud. Aaliyah. His voice came out rougher than he intended. You look well. I am well, she said, and something in the way she said it, plainly, without performance, told him this was simply true, not a wound she was covering with composure. He had rehearsed, in the months since Ashan's file first crossed his desk, dozens of versions of what he might say to her, if this moment ever arrived. Every version he'd practiced felt suddenly, standing in front of the real woman, inadequate. I know the truth, he said finally. About the documents. About Patricia. About Vanessa. I know none of it was ever true. Aaliyah studied him for a long moment, a moment during which Jung-hwan felt more exposed than he had in any negotiation, any confrontation, any moment of his old dangerous life. I know too, she said simply. I've known for years. Something in his chest tightened at the confirmation, at the casual, unforced certainty with which she said it, as though the years of injustice had long since stopped being a wound and become simply part of her history, examined and understood and set down. I am sorry, he said. I know those words can't undo what I did. I know 6 years together should have counted for more than a folder of lies. I let my pride convict you before I ever really listened to you, and I have spent every day since regretting it. Several nearby guests had noticed the exchange by now, conversations quieting into the particular hush that accompanies public confessions people weren't quite meant to overhear. Jung-hwan did not lower his voice. Whatever remained of his pride, he had decided somewhere in the months of searching for her, was not worth protecting anymore, not at the cost of one more moment of dishonesty. You chose to believe them, Aaliyah said, because believing them was easier than trusting me. I understand that now in a way I didn't understand it then. But understanding why you did it doesn't make it hurt less that you did. I know, he said. The song hitting your ears right now is the sound of a woman who has already won, whatever happens next. If this story is moving you the way it's moving thousands of others, comment the word justice below, so we know you're rooting for Aaliyah too. The gala continued around them, the low murmur of conversation resuming as guests politely returned their attention elsewhere, though Jung-hwan suspected several were still listening, curious about the strange, quiet drama unfolding near the center of the room. There's something else, Aaliyah said, and something in her tone shifted, gentler now, though no less certain. Something you should see. She led him toward a quieter corner of the venue, where a small group of children had gathered near a table of desserts, supervised by a volunteer from the foundation. Among them, a little girl of perhaps 6, dark curls pulled back in a neat braid, looked up, spotted Aaliyah, and broke into a run. Mom, the girl called, weaving between guests with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who knows exactly where safety lies. Jung-hwan felt the word land like a physical blow. The girl reached Aaliyah and wrapped both arms around her legs, and Aaliyah bent down without hesitation, lifting her easily, settling her onto one hip with the practiced ease of years of doing exactly this. It was only when the girl turned her face toward Jung-hwan, curious about the stranger her mother had stopped to talk to, that he recognized the particular shape of her eyes, so precisely like his own daughter's that his breath caught in his throat. Jung-hwan, Aaliyah said quietly, watching his face carefully. This is Hannah. The name landed harder than the title had. Hannah was the name he and Vanessa had given their daughter. The daughter Vanessa had abandoned in a nursery years earlier while fleeing the country with what remained of his fortune. How, he started, and could not finish the question. When Vanessa left, Aaliyah said, I heard about it. It wasn't hard to hear about, given how it was covered in the press at the time. I don't know exactly why I reached out. Perhaps because I understood, better than most people could, exactly what it felt like to be abandoned by someone who should have protected you. I couldn't leave a child to suffer for choices she had no part in making. Jung-hwan stared at her, uncomprehending. But I had custody. I raised her. For the first 2 years, yes, Aaliyah said gently. But your empire's collapse hit harder than you let anyone see, Jung-hwan. There were months when you were barely able to keep the lights on, let alone care for a toddler alone while rebuilding a business from ruins. You reached out to an old family friend for temporary help. Do you remember? Someone who said they knew someone reliable, someone who wouldn't ask questions, someone who could take her for a while until you stabilized. Understanding began to dawn on his face, slow and disbelieving.
That was you, he said.
The arrangement was made through an intermediary. I never knew who. Ask that my name be kept out of it, Aaliyah said. I didn't want you thanking me, and I certainly didn't want you thinking it changed anything between us. I did it for her, not for you. A little girl who had already lost one mother to selfishness deserved better than losing a second one to a stranger's indifference. You've raised her for 4 years, Jung-hwan said, the numbers arranging themselves in his mind with dawning horror at how much of his own daughter's childhood he had unknowingly missed. I thought the temporary arrangement, I assumed it had simply continued through a placement agency. I never imagined. I gave her the love I never received myself, growing up in a house where love was rationed according to whose blood ran pure, Aaliyah said. I couldn't undo what was done to me, but I could make sure it wasn't done to her. Hannah, growing bored with adult conversation she couldn't follow, tugged gently at Aaliyah's collar. Can we get cake now? In a minute, sweetheart, Aaliyah said, and the easy warmth in her voice, entirely unforced, told Jung-hwan everything he needed to know about the years he had missed. This was not an obligation Aaliyah had shouldered. This was love, freely given, built patiently over years he had no part in. If you're feeling every bit of this moment, take a second to like this video. It costs nothing, but it tells us this story is landing exactly the way we hoped it would. In the weeks following the gala, Jung-hwan visited Aaliyah's foundation office 3 times, each visit brief, each conversation careful, both of them navigating the strange new terrain of 2 people who had once shared everything and now shared, essentially, only a complicated history and a child neither could pretend didn't connect them. He did not push for reconciliation in those early visits. Something in Aaliyah's steady composure told him that pushing would cost him whatever fragile trust these visits were slowly rebuilding, not between them as former spouses, but between him and the daughter he was only now, belatedly, getting to know again. Hannah warmed to him slowly, the way children do with strangers who share their features, but not their history. She called him by his name at first, not any familial title, and Jung-hwan found himself grateful for even that much, understanding he had done nothing yet to earn anything closer. Meanwhile, the consequences Patricia and Vanessa had spent years avoiding finally caught up to them both, delivered not through anyone's engineered revenge, but through the simple, patient mechanism of justice operating on its own timeline. Ishan's investigation, once formally submitted to authorities, triggered a broader inquiry into the fraud that had destroyed both Aaliyah's marriage and, indirectly, Jung-hwan's empire. Patricia was arrested within months, charged with conspiracy and fraud related to the fabricated evidence, the specifics of the forged documents traced conclusively back through the same intermediaries Ishan had identified. She faced the charges with the same brittle composure she had spent decades perfecting, though composure, in a courtroom, buys very little sympathy from a judge presented with years of documented deception. Vanessa fared no better, though her downfall arrived through a different mechanism entirely. The wealthy businessman she had fled the country with, initially charmed by her cunning and confidence, grew suspicious over time of the same qualities that had once attracted him, discovering, eventually, that Vanessa had been quietly diverting portions of his own fortune into accounts he couldn't trace, an old habit, apparently, that marriage to new money hadn't cured. He ended the relationship abruptly, freezing what joint assets he could and leaving Vanessa, for the first time in her life, with genuinely nothing, no husband, no fortune, no family name left untarnished by scandal, no sister left willing to extend the endless grace Vanessa had spent a lifetime taking for granted. She reached out to Aaliyah exactly once, months later, a brief message asking for help rebuilding, appealing with breathtaking audacity to whatever family loyalty might remain. Aaliyah did not respond with cruelty. She responded, simply, with silence, the same silence Vanessa had once offered a sister she'd betrayed for years without a flicker of remorse. Some debts, Aaliyah had come to understand, are not meant to be repaid. They are simply meant to be left unpaid, a permanent record of what was taken and never returned. We're approaching the ending now, and I promise it's worth every minute you've spent watching. If you haven't already, subscribe now so you catch every twist as we build toward the finale. Nearly a year after the gala, Jung-hwan asked Aaliyah for one final conversation, arranged carefully, at her office rather than anywhere that might carry the weight of their old life together. "I know I have no right to ask this," he said, once they were seated, Hannah occupied in an adjoining room with a foundation staff member who had grown fond of her over the months of visits. "But I have to ask it anyway, because I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I didn't. Is there any chance at all, that we could try again? Not the life we had before. Something new. Something honest, this time, built the way it should have been built from the start." Aaliyah did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, and Jung-hwan watched something move across her face that he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not the old grief, something calmer and more final than either. "Jung-hwan," she said finally, "for years after the divorce, I wondered if I would ever stop feeling like something had been stolen from me. I wondered if I'd spend the rest of my life measuring everything against what I lost. It took me a long time to understand that the version of peace I finally found wasn't about winning or proving you wrong, or even about you at all. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed your validation to know her own worth." "I understand," he said quietly, though his voice suggested he was still hoping, somewhere, that understanding might not be the final answer. "Forgiveness gave me peace," Aaliyah continued. "That much is true. I don't carry hatred for you anymore, and I don't want Hannah growing up sensing bitterness between the two people who love her most. But returning to what we had, or trying to build something new on the same foundation that already broke once, that would cost me the very peace I worked so hard to build. I won't trade that for anything. Not even for you. Yunghwan absorbed the answer slowly, the finality of it settling into a place that ached but, he recognized with some surprise, did not shatter him the way the same rejection might have shattered him years earlier. He had spent the past year learning, painfully, what it meant to sit with consequences rather than fight them, and something in that learning had prepared him, however imperfectly, for exactly this moment. Then let me ask for something smaller, he said. Let me be part of Hannah's life, in whatever way you'll allow it. Let me earn back, slowly, whatever trust one can. Not for us. For her. Aaliyah studied him for a long moment, and this time, something in her expression softened, not into romantic possibility, but into something perhaps more valuable, respect for a man finally asking for the right thing, in the right way, for the right reasons. That, she said, I can agree to. She rose, walked to the door, and called Hannah back into the room. The little girl ran to Aaliyah first, the way she always did, then paused, looking between the two adults with the particular perceptiveness children carry more often than adults credit them for. Are you sad? She asked Yunghwan. He considered the question honestly before answering. A little, he said, but I think I'm going to be okay. Good, Hannah said, satisfied, and reached for his hand with the easy, uncomplicated trust of a child who had not yet learned to hold grudges she had no part in creating. Yunghwan closed his fingers gently around hers, and Aaliyah, watching, allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first she had offered him in years that carried no guardedness at all. She walked out of the room a moment later, leaving father and daughter to a conversation that belonged only to them, and did not look back. Not because she was punishing him with distance, but because for the first time since that night behind the couch years earlier, she understood, completely, that she had nothing left to prove to anyone in that room, including herself. This is exactly the moment we've been building toward, and if this story moved you even half as much as it moved us while writing it, please hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that peace is always worth more than revenge. Months passed, and the shape of a new, careful normal began to settle around all of them. Patricia's trial concluded with a conviction that surprised no one who had followed the case closely, years of documented conspiracy, leaving little room for the kind of ambiguity that might have earned leniency. She would spend the coming years, the court determined, paying a debt that money alone could never fully settle, since what she had truly stolen wasn't recoverable through any sentence a judge could hand down. Vanessa's decline continued along its own quieter, sadder trajectory. Without fortune, without family, without the particular currency of beauty and cunning that had once opened every door she wanted, she found the world considerably less accommodating than the one she'd grown up believing was owed to her. She occasionally surfaced in gossip coverage, briefly, unflatteringly, before fading again into the kind of obscurity that people who have spent their lives craving attention find hardest of all to bear. Aaliyah's foundation expanded, opening scholarship programs for young women from backgrounds like her own, families where love had been rationed rather than given freely, and shelters for women rebuilding their lives after the particular devastation of being betrayed by people who should have protected them. She spoke, when asked, about her own story with a frankness that surprised interviewers expecting bitterness and finding instead something closer to hard-won wisdom. Betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story, she told one reporter in an interview that would later be widely shared. It can be the beginning of a better one if you let it. Not because the betrayal was worth it. It never is. But because what you build afterward can be entirely, finally yours. Yunghwan, for his part, chose a path few who had known him in his old life would have predicted. Rather than attempting to rebuild the empire that had cost him everything he'd once valued, he began volunteering, quietly and without fanfare, at one of the community centers Aaliyah's foundation operated, mentoring young men who reminded him, in ways he found humbling, of the ambitious, hardened young man he had once been before pride had cost him the best thing he'd ever built. He learned patience in that work. He learned, more slowly and more painfully, that redemption isn't a single grand gesture, a public apology delivered once and considered settled. It is instead a long series of ordinary days, showing up consistently, choosing honesty even when it costs something, earning trust one small kept promise at a time. His relationship with Hannah grew slowly, but steadily across those months, built through weekend visits and patient conversations and the accumulating weight of a father who, for the first time, showed up reliably instead of disappearing into the demands of an empire that had never once, in the end, loved him back the way his daughter did. One evening, nearly 2 years after the gala where Jung-hwan had first seen Aaliyah across a crowded room, Hannah ran to him after a weekend visit, wrapped her arms around him tightly, and told him, unprompted, that she loved him. He held her for a long moment, longer than the hug strictly required, before she pulled away, satisfied, and ran back toward the car where Aaliyah waited to take her home. Jung-hwan stood in the driveway and watched them go, understanding, finally, something it had taken him nearly a decade and the total collapse of everything he'd once valued to learn. Love cannot be reclaimed through regret alone. It has to be earned, patiently, through the accumulation of actions that prove, over time, that a person has actually changed rather than simply apologized for who they used to be. He realized, still earning it. He suspected he would be earning it for the rest of his life. For the first time in longer than he could remember, that thought did not frighten him. It felt, instead, like the first honest foundation he had ever built anything on. Aaliyah, watching her daughter climb into the car beside her, glanced once more at Jung-hwan standing in the fading evening light, and felt none of the old grief that memory had once carried. What remained was simpler than grief, quieter than triumph. It was peace, hard-earned and entirely her own, the kind no betrayal, however devastating, could ever again take from her. She drove home as the sun began to set over the city, Hannah chattering happily beside her about the weekend's small adventures, and Aaliyah Monroe, who had once hidden behind a couch listening to her whole world collapse, understood finally and completely that she had not survived that night by accident. She had survived it because somewhere beneath the heartbreak, she had always known her own worth, even in the moment she needed that knowledge most. It had simply taken her years to remember it fully and rebuild a life loud enough to prove it. Some people lose everything because they were betrayed. Others lose everything because they chose to believe lies instead of the people who actually loved them. But in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming someone her past could no longer reach, no longer diminish, and no longer define. If this story touched you the way it touched us telling it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because there's so many more stories like this one still to come, and we would love for you to be here when they arrive.